Hello and welcome to your channel IELTS.TOEFL Academy. Today we are going to go through the first task of writing in IELTS Academy. As you know, in this exam, IELTS exam, and especially the academic one, we are given graphs, diagrams, charts, or maybe a table. Now, here we have a set of vocabulary to describe these trends. We can have different trends like upward trend, downward trend, stable, let's say, trend, or sometimes fluctuation trend. Here, the verbs that we use for these trends, we have also some noun forms. Maybe you ask why we just use different forms, verbs and nouns. This is mostly because we don't want to have a redundancy in our writing. We don't want to repeat the same verb twice because it is going to just maybe have a kind of negative point for us. Therefore, we are going to use the different forms. Maybe you can use even different words. But if you have to actually use the same word, so you can use the verb form once and the noun form the next time. Let's go with the upward trends. Here in the upward trends, we can use verbs such as increased, grew, escalated, rose, etc. And in the noun forms, we can use an increasive, the growth was, the escalation, the rose of, etc. For example, here, as you see here, we have the upward trend in, for example, corn sweeteners. You can see. So here, for this part of the graph, you can use actually the verb increase. Or, for example, the corn, the production or sales or whatever of the corn sweeteners increased through years 1966 to 1980, let's say 4. So we can have we can use these verbs to show that there was an upward trend. The second set of verbs and nouns that we can use are for downward trend. For downward trend, we can use these verbs like decreased, declined, fell, diminished, etc. Definitely we have different words, but I use just a few of them. And nouns that we can have, then actually the noun form of these verbs, we can say a decrease of, a decline of, a fall of, etc. And as you can see here, for example, about the refined cane and beet sugars, you can see that there has been a kind of decrease, or let's say downward trend. So you can use verbs such as decrease, decline, fell, diminish to describe this downward trend. The third set of the verbs and nouns that we use are for actually stability, not moving, not actually going up and down a lot. No upward trend, no downward trend, just remaining the same. So these verbs can be verbs such as stabilized, plateaued, remained steady, remained relatively stable, etc. We can use as verbs, and noun forms we can use the verbs such as stability and plateau. Here, for example, for the production, or let's say sales or whatever it is, if you see for honey, it hasn't actually moved up and down a lot, and as you can see, it has a kind of stable trend. So we can use verbs or noun forms that we have here, first thing to showing that the trend stayed the same. The third form, or the third, let's say, set of the verbs and nouns that we can use for describing the graphs is the fluctuation trends. So what is fluctuation? Fluctuation means going up and down. going up and down. So we can use verbs such as fluctuated, varied, differed, or etc. And the noun forms we can use like fluctuations, differences, etc. Here, for example, we had about the total actually. If you see here, we have a kind of fluctuation in this part, as you see here, lots of up and downs, but not upward, not downward, or not stable, just somehow going up and down, decrease, increase a lot. Now, here we have a set of adverbs to show the intensity of these trends, to describe how intense these actually, let's say, upward, downward trends were. So we can use adverbs such as dramatically, substantially, sharply, considerably, remarkably, slightly, etc., just to describe the uh, verbs such as decreased, increased, escalated, rose, fell. Here is very important, a very important note to say that for the verb fluctuate, we cannot use the verb sharply because fluctuation is actually in a span of time is happening with lots of up and downs, and it is not sharp. Here, again, for example, if you see here, so we can say that there was a kind of actually slight, let's say, decrease, slightly decreased. Or we can see here that there was a kind of, let's say, sharp increase, or let's say um, considerably decreased here in the third one. Now, some other verbs that we have actually very important are the verbs fluctuate and plateau. Sometimes these verbs or these noun forms even are mistaken by many candidates. First of all, let's say that fluctuate, as I told you before, means somehow going up and down. So as you see here, we have lots of upward and downward trends. So this is a kind of fluctuation. But plateau means remaining stable, but not for a short while, but not short for a short time, but for a long time. For example, here in the second graph, you can see that for over 5 years, I think maybe more than 5 years, remained the same. The trend remained the same. Nothing changed. 500, that's all. So don't mistake these words. And we can have fluctuation for upward and downward trends, but plateau for remaining stable for a while, especially for a long time. Peak and bottom out. You know, peak is the highest point, and we can refer to this actually trend, the highest point of the, let's say, sales or any actually trend that we can have, any, you know, anything that the graph shows. So here we can have the peak of the graph in this line graph. For example, the peak was in the August. So it reached that peak. We don't say the highest peak because peak is just the highest point. So we cannot say the highest peak. So we say it reached the peak or it reached its peak in August. The word bottom out is actually means to reach its, let's say, the least point, the least amount. So here we can say that from 1990 to 1995, we had the trend as just decreasing to the lowest point. So the line graph bottomed out and during 1990 to 1995. I mean, by the line graph, I mean by the sales or the number of the cases or whatever that the graph is showing. Now, the last but the very important words that we have here. The first word is overall. Many people think that, overall, by the word overall, we mean to reach to a conclusion. It is not actually a conclusion. When we are referring to an overall idea of the graph or an overall trend of the graph, we want to show that how the graph, how the, for example, sales, how the population or whatever the graph is showing increased or decreased. For example, here, as you see, it started from the number 1,000, and it reached to a number about, I think, 2,100, something like this. So overall, there was a kind of increase. So when you are using the word overall, you are going to talk about the decrease or increase of the diagram or the trend. Now, span. What is a span? What is the word span? Span is actually the word that is just showing you the time of the changes. So you can also use this word when you are using the word overall to show that how this sale or this population or this trend changed during a year, during months, or during, for example, centuries. So the span of the actually trend can be a year, can be a century, can be a month, can be a week, etc. As you see here, our span of time is just a full year. So we can say that the sales increased, or we had an overall increase during a year.